We're going to start by introduction from Cecilia Graham, who's from the Student Union. So she's going to start this first bit, and then we'll go into the main lecture after that.
Cool. Hi everyone. So yeah, I'm Cecilia, and I'm the Camberwell Engagement Coordinator for the Student Union. I'm just going to have a quick chat to tell you what the Student Union do and how we can help you throughout your time at Camberwell. So you're automatically a member as soon as you enrol, which I'm sure you all have. So you don't need to fill out any forms. And we have a wide range of societies, sports and creative opportunities that you can get involved in whilst you're here. We're also involved in loads of campaigns, and we help fund student-led projects and facilitate student-led events as well. We're run by 4 full-time officers, so we have our welfare officer, campaigns officer, education and activities officer. So you feel free to get in touch with any of them. So for example, if you want to run a campaign, you can get in touch with Sahaya, who's the campaigns officer, or if you want to see more activities at Camberwell, you can get in touch with Leah. We also have a range of liberation officers, so LGBTQ plus officer, Black students officer and women's officer as well. We have loads and loads of societies, which some of you may have met at the Freshers' Fair, but if you didn't get a chance to go, don't worry, because you can sign up to them throughout the year. So we have Curation, Arts Fams, we also have Life Drawing, and loads of them are based at Camberwell, so it's really convenient for you to join as well. And you can join them on our website. We also have loads of sports, and again, you can join them throughout the year. They're super cheap compared to gyms. Our class pass is also really cheap, so you can get free yoga classes. And again, you can get all this information on our website, artssu.com. We also have a ton of creative opportunities, which I would definitely urge you to get involved in. And just to say that it's really important, if you want to get involved in all of these things, to follow us on our Facebook or Twitter or our Instagram. I'll also be sending you our emails, so if you get an email from Cecilia Graham, don't put it in your junk mail. So we have loads of partnerships with the Royal Academy, V&A, Wallace Collection and British Museum, and we get involved in like British Museum Lates or RA Lates, where you can show your work and also get involved in hosting workshops for the general public as well. And the students who take part in these get loads of great exposure externally. So it's really definitely don't pass on these opportunities. We also have an annual exhibition called Exhibit, which is open to all students from foundation to postgrad, and that is in an external gallery, and it's judged by externals as well. So last year the judge was Grayson Perry, which is pretty cool. So who knows who it will be next year. And we also have loads of exhibition spaces throughout UAL. We've got one opening in Camberwell in November, and that's a student-led space. So again, keep your eyes peeled for that, because it's a really great opportunity to show your work. So Made in Arts London is a not-for-profit enterprise that works within the Student Union, and it promotes and sells art by students. We do have open calls for these. The next one will be in second term. And the really great thing about Made in Arts is that they actually support you 2 years after you graduate. So they'll still show your work in exhibitions and have your work, bring your work to art fairs like the Affordable Art Fair as well. So again, definitely do keep your eyes peeled for that. We also have the Student Initiative Fund, which postgraduate students are super engaged in, so I'm expecting some pretty great things. It's a fund that I have to give to students for external projects, so you can get up to £200 for a project that's outside of your course. In the past we've funded things like zines, workshops, and of course exhibitions, and we've actually got more funding for it this year, so definitely do apply. And yeah, like I said, I run it, so you can email c.graham@su.arts.ac.uk if you're interested, or you can just visit me in the Student Union office in the Student Centre as well. We also do loads of democracy things, so if you're getting settled into your course and you want to get involved in the Student Union, you can nominate yourself to become the postgraduate officer. It's a role that gives you the opportunity to generate ideas for social events, And you can also come up with campaigns that aim at improving workspaces or just your general time at UAL. And you do make a difference. It sounds really, really cheesy, but we have had postgraduate officers who have helped slash printing fees, for example, at UAL. So it is a really great role. And again, if you're interested, you can visit me in the Student Union office, or we have a drop-in on the 17th of October. It's actually over at Wilson Road, just in case you're wondering where MGO4 is. We also have course reps, which your tutor may have spoken to you about, but if not, you will hear about it. So course reps are very much the link between students and staff, and you get to voice either your concerns or the really positive things about your course as well. You get to voice them to the dean, so it is a really great opportunity if you want to meet people high up at UAL. And any student can be a rep. You don't need to have experience, so if you didn't do it at undergrad level, don't worry, you can do it at postgrad. We also have a free and impartial advice service. They're based at High Holborn, but they do drop-ins at Camberwell as well, and they offer advice on things like housing, industry advice as well. We have an industry advice week in March, and also academic issues that you may come across. So yeah, keep in touch. You can find me in the Student Centre on Mondays to Wednesday, and Wilson Road on Fridays. And definitely do take down my email, because if you've got any questions, if I can't answer them, I'll signpost you to the people who can. And there are social media accounts as well. So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. So if a bit like last week, there's a lot of information there. But you'll be glad to know that I've now set up fully a YouTube list which is going to have captured the lectures and things like that. So it's an unlisted YouTube. So if you search YouTube, you won't find this. So it's a link only for you. That's the short way of typing it in. And I will make sure it's already on Moodle. I've put it on Moodle, and I'll make sure that your course leaders email it to you as well. But if you want to, you can write it down now. For some weird reason, and I really don't know what's going on, because it's absolutely fine as before. This has, see that? See that white box there? It's, for some reason, a white box has appeared on the screen, and I can't get rid of it. So there isn't. That's just YouTube, and then a number 2 on that bit there. And you'll see that already I put up the welcome event from last week. So that's available if you missed that, or you want to go over it again because it was so exciting and you want to get all that information, it's there. So just like I've just captured the Student Union bit there as well, so all that information will be available so you can see that. And then one other bit of practical stuff before we really get started. The academic language development, I mentioned this last week in the welcome event. That is starting this week, so particularly if English is not your first language, this is ideal for you. These are free classes to improve your levels of English. It's specifically for MA Visual Arts students, so it's not a general thing for any student, so it's specifically MA Visual Arts, and we are trying to tie it in much more closely to the rhythm of the way the course works. It will be 10 o'clock till 11:30. I think this first week will probably just a class through the whole time, because no one will have booked a one-to-one tutorial, which is what will happen in most weeks. And it's going to be in A207, which if you're an MA illustration student, you know where that is, because that's your studio. It's not 207. What's it called? What if you're an illustration student, you know what your number your studio is? No? I think it's A207. But anyway, look for signs for the MA illustration studio, and you'll find it. I'm pretty sure it's certainly, if it's not A207, it's A208. The reason for the confusion is all the room numbers have changed this summer. So everything that we were familiar with has now been changed with this new building. So that's why we're a bit unfamiliar with where things are at. Right, let's get started then. So this is over the next 8 weeks, there's going to be a series of lectures looking at research methods and methodologies for artists and designers. So it's very specific to that, to practice-based art and design, not a kind of a general thing of this is what research methods and methodologies look like if you're involved in science or even social science. So we're going to focus specifically on things which are relevant to you and to the courses which you are doing. There's going to be different voices, different opinions. There'll be some things which may contradict with each other from week to week. But that's for you to negotiate your way through and kind of find out the things which are useful. There's a different speaker each week, although one person, Professor Paul Caldwell, is going to be doing 2 sessions because they kind of connect together, split by a couple of weeks. And you're going to get some stuff like today. It's going to be a little bit more theory. There'll be other stuff where people are talking about their own practice and what that actually looks like. So there'll be a range of different approaches. And hopefully there'll be something which is useful for you to put into practice from all of that. Just at this very beginning, just to highlight, I'm going to come to this a bit later again, but just to highlight the difference between methodology and methods. So the methodology is the overarching idea, the overarching structure. The methods are the tools which you use to fulfill that overarching structure. Think of it as simple as that, and then we'll have a look at it again in a bit later. I'm going to suggest today one particular type of methodology, an overall idea, which is action research. Has anybody come across action research as a research methodology before? Yes, so somebody has. So if I'm wrong, you can correct me. In principle, just to say, I have no problem with people kind of jumping in. You're going to be doing some work yourself anyway. But if you've got questions or you're a little bit confused, you want me to repeat something, just jump in. If you disagree with me, jump in. It's not a problem. I'm not expecting you just to sit here silently writing down everything I say as if what I say is accurate. You are allowed to kind of negotiate that. So we're going to look at action research. But at the very beginning, I want a question for you. So this is a question for all of you. What is the first thing that comes into your mind when you hear the word research?
Investigation.
Investigation, yeah.
Whether it be of text, images.
Yeah, so text, images, movies, and investigating something. Yeah, great. Anything else? What's the first thing that comes into your mind? There's no right or wrong answer here. Looking, yeah. Using your eyes, observing. Anything else? Library, yeah. Okay, that's interesting. That's the first thing that comes into your mind. The research, library, yeah. A lot of people, that's the first thing that comes into their mind, yeah. The first thing that comes into mind? Books, yeah. Internet. Sorry? Somebody said something? What's the first thing that comes into your mind? Google. Yes, of course. Anything else? Gathering information. What's the first thing that comes into mind when you hear the word researcher? Fixed-term contracts. Yes, okay. There's someone who's familiar with some of the procedures of academia. Yeah, fixed-term contract. What's the first thing that comes to mind? Researcher. Academic. Experts. Yeah. You're rather blank today. There's nothing coming to your mind when you hear the word researcher. Someone who experiments. Yeah. Curiosity. Yeah. What do they look like? What does a researcher look like? Big, thick rimmed glasses. Yeah. Yes. And what else was that?
Sort of square.
Yeah.
And like a lab coat.
And a lab coat. Classically, a big white coat and big thick glasses. Yeah. Sorry? Or tweed. Yeah. With those kind of funny patches that go there. Yeah. What else might they look like?
A clipboard and a pen.
Clipboard and a pen. Yeah. Did anybody, when you saw that, when I asked the question, did anybody think me? As in you, yourself? Did anybody think that? Yes? Yeah. A couple of people did. Yeah. Because that's what you are. That's the intriguing thing in this process. Joining a master's course, you are becoming researchers. and we're going to explore a little bit about what that means. Another question for you, and I want you to do this in groups of about 3 people. So you're going to have to move, so you're going to have to find some people around you over there on your own. So I want you to get into groups of 3 people, approximately, it doesn't matter if it's 2 or 4, but no more than 4. And I've got a question for you, and I want you to work on it I'm going to give you a few minutes to work on this. And this is the question. How would you research the impact of eating fruit on a group of 100 children living in an economically disadvantaged community in London? So there are 100 children living in an area of economic challenge, and you want to understand the impact of eating fruit on these children. How would you go about it? What would you do? Literally, step by step, what would you do in response to that? So I'm going to give you, let's see, I'll give you 3 minutes to come up with a research plan for that piece of research. Okay? So, what are your plans? How are you going to do this? Give me some ideas.
I thought memory tests throughout I think it's an easy way to test if their minds are getting sharper because of the sort of improved nutrition. So you introduce the fruit and you measure how much fruit they're eating, and then you sort of administer a memory test every week over sort of 2 months and see if their score improves.
Okay. So a simple kind of way of trying to create some data. So you've got something at the beginning, something partway through, something towards the end, which shows some kind of sense of progression and something that's changed because of it. Yeah. How would you balance that against? How would you know that it's the fruit that was actually doing that?
You need a control group
You'd need a control group
of children who have the same characteristics or not eating fruit.
So you need a control group of children who are similar to this other group but are not eating fruit, so you compare the two. Anybody see a problem with that if you had the control group? Say again? Yeah, well, exactly. So you said you get scurvy, so if you don't eat certain fruit, you actually get ill. So there's a bit of a problem. If you've got 100 children, you say, well, let's have 50 over here and we won't give them fruit, and 50 over here and we will give them fruit, then potentially you're going to do serious damage to this group. If your hypothesis is that eating fruit is good, which we know that eating vitamin C is essential, because we learned that 150 years ago, 200 years ago, when people started sailing around the world and realised you couldn't survive without having vitamin C of oranges or limes or lemons. So we know that already. So your hypothesis is that eating fruit is good. You've got a group over here, you're not going to give them fruit. You're going to cause some problems. The parents are not going to be happy.
Well, you're basically talking about a group of kids that are part of an economically disadvantaged community. So you can compare it to another type of community, to kids from another economic status.
Yeah. But
You
again,
don't need
setting up a comparison, you've got a problem, because if you've got a group from this economically challenged area and a group from a wealthy area, if you want to put it in terms like that, how do you know that they're not already eating lots and lots of fruits or not eating fruits? It becomes a challenge, doesn't it?
You could use the same group as a control group. Before you start administering the fruit, you could measure it over time to see if what you're testing is having a big impact on it's changing over time. If it is, then they're just getting better at it, and you measure the impact of the fruit.
Yeah.
Because you could measure if the fruit makes them get better faster, but then you're not sort of taking fruit away from another group. You're not being like, oh, you don't get fruit for 2 months because we want to measure these kids.
So by working with the same group, then potentially you might just be able to get around some of the ethical questions. I think you still have a challenge actually, but I think it's possible you might be able to get around some of the challenges. Comment down here.
We realise that you can't assume that everyone who lives in an economically disadvantaged community is not eating fruit and veg. So we thought we'd start by doing a weekly diary, so they have to document what they eat at home, at school, and again at home in the evening. So that then when you divide them into groups, whatever you're going to do, one group oranges, one group bananas, then you divide up those that already have a fruit-rich diet across the groups.
Yeah. So I think the basic assumption of your idea is interesting, in that you can't assume something from the beginning about this particular group of children, and therefore trying to understand it is the first step, to understand what's actually going on with that group of children. Not assuming that they don't, like making an assumption they live in an economically challenged area, therefore they're probably not spending money on fruit. That's an unfair assumption. I think you can't really make that assumption. It's easy to think that, but I think you've got to be very careful about that. Any other comments about how you'd go about doing this piece of research?
Well, if we're looking specifically at fruit, would you not give the control group supplements that include their sort of required vitamins, and then give the other group specific fruits, so that they're getting fibre and fruits and various benefits there, but the other group is not disadvantaged in the vitamins?
So again, your suggestion of having one group with vitamins and one group with actual fruit, again, what you're trying to do still is trying to find some kind of control between the two. And this is the usual scenario with research, is you need a control group. You need something where you haven't done it to that thing, whatever it is, and I have done it to this thing, so you can then compare the two. The problem when you're dealing with people is you can't really do that. It starts to get very messy, very confusing, and a huge amount of research with people simply would not pass ethics committees, which are very, very strict about not causing any potential harm or damage to somebody, and really, really strict about that. And that's not just kind of physical, but actually emotional or their general well-being as well. So it's a challenge to always be looking for this kind of control group idea. All of these ideas are interesting, but it's always a challenge to find that. Any other comments about how you'd go about this? Sorry.
You could approach it completely from the point of view of the economics.
Yeah.
So that you could work out, and I haven't thought this through, you could work out something about analysing the budgets, the food budgets of how people are spending their money, and see whether if a control group or any other group you have was actually encouraged to spend more of the family income on fruit or veg or whatever it is, then you could perhaps it would take a long time. You've got to have it's a long-term project, otherwise see whether that had any difference. It would be about encouraging people to spend their money differently.
So I think what's interesting what you're saying there is that idea of long time. That it's not necessarily a quick, simple thing here. That it's something that you might want to spend a lengthy amount of time, and it's not so easy to say, we did this, therefore this happened. It's, well, we spent time with these people and we negotiated, we understood we took some of this kind of research that you were talking about beforehand. Maybe you do play around with kind of different interventions at different times, but it takes time, and it's not quite a clean cut as that we did that to it and that we didn't. It's messier and a little bit more confusing because it's people, and that's kind of reality, because you can't treat people in as something, I'm going to stick this in you and not stick it in you and see what happens. You can't do that to human beings. Any other thoughts about how you could go about this particular thing?
I think it depends what you mean by impact, because impact on what their well-being,
Yeah.
their cognitive recognition, so it varies in different testing. So it's like, if it's well-being, then you can just say, you can measure how they feel every day by just asking them questions once they've been exposed to a substantially larger amount of fruit. So, yeah.
It's a really good point. Like, all of that statement is really complex. There's so many different things we could pull apart just in that statement there. And the word impact is a really important part of that as well. What on earth does that mean? What are you looking for? And there's certain assumptions we can make from that statement, and that's in many ways, that's a really bad. It's not even a research question. It's just I've deliberately written it to be provocative because it's actually quite badly put together. Because it raises questions exactly that. What do we mean by impact? What are you actually looking for? What are you actually exploring? But I've done this partly because I want to kind of explode this idea a little bit, that it isn't necessarily a nice, simple, clean thing. For most people, when they think about research, you think about the lab coats and the experiments and the thing where there's a control group and there's something set up like that. For artists and designers, we're going to approach things very differently to that. And action research was kind of developed really in the 1940s within social sciences. as a way to cope with the messiness of the confusion of actually working with people and real situations, rather than just this simple idea of here's a control thing and here's something which I'm doing something or not doing too. Here's a quote, slightly complex, but there's some important points in it. One of the founding figures of action research, Kurt Lewin, in 1952, remarked that research which produced nothing but books was inadequate. The task, as Mark suggested in his thesis on Feuerbach, forget that that's not that important, but the task is not merely to understand and interpret the world, but to change it. And there's something quite interesting about that there's room and space for something to change, and not just that this is, I'm removed from this experiment happens over here and I'm removed from it. Instead, action research recognised that your presence played a significant role in this. So going back to that idea of looking at fruits and all the complexity of that, the reality is that you being there changes the very scenario of that situation. So, for example, if you did go to 100 children and you started talking about fruit, the very fact you're there talking about fruit changes their perception of fruit. They're not saying which way, but it just changes it. So you can't remove yourself, you can't put yourself in a truly objective position outside of it. You're subjective, you're involved in it, you're in the middle of it. And therefore, action research was kind of developed to say, well, let's accept that. That's okay. That's all right. Let's work with that and find a way where we can still do research and move our knowledge forward and recognise that we are part of it. And fundamentally, because it isn't just about creating some abstract knowledge there, it's about bringing about change in given situations. And in particular, for us, in the change in our practice, in our art and design practice. So what is action research? In many ways, it's really simple, but there's many, many layers of complexity to it. But in very simple terms, it is simply research into practice by the practitioner to change and improve. That's it. So it's research into, think about it for yourself. You think about the art or the design, the stuff that you create, it is research into that by you so that you can change and improve. In those terms, it's relatively simple. There's kind of lots of different layers to it. But it doesn't need to be any more complicated than that. You are researching your work. You are the experts in your work. And you're researching that so that you can become better in that work as well. It's also, it's important that it's action and research. It's this unique combination. It's quite easy to do actions, to make things, and not do any research. It's quite easy to do research and not act, and not make anything. It's the unique combination of these two things which makes this into something which is very helpful as a framework, particularly for us as artists and designers. It's possibly, you could argue this actually a little bit more than we normally do. This kind of process, which I'll show you in a minute, is fairly comfortable and familiar for artists and designers. But what we're asking, particularly at master's level, we're asking you to push a little bit further. And it's possibly doing a little bit more than you would normally do in terms of thinking and investigating your process and who you are when you're doing it as well. It's also raising questions, it's not just simply saying there's a problem and I want to find a solution to the problem. It's actually looking at a situation and saying, I want to ask more questions about it. So it doesn't see problems as pathologies, it doesn't see them as negatives, as difficulties. It sees problems as something which encourages questions. So the whole process should actually encourage you to question even more, not necessarily just to be looking for answers. And ultimately, it's about improving and changing your practice. Now, I'm going to give you 4 characteristics. It's always dangerous when you do this type of thing, when you take something which is relatively simple but has lots of complexity and layers to it. To kind of characterise it in 4 key words is it's a nice thing to go on screen there, but it kind of misses the depth and the complexity of it a little bit. So I'm called them characteristics. It isn't that it is exactly like this. It isn't that it is always these things. These are flavours and characteristics of what action research is. Some of these will resonate with you more than others, but I'm going to go through them each one. We're just going to discuss them a little bit. I'm going to focus particularly on one of them. The first thing is that action research is cyclical in that it goes round and round and round. And there's nothing particularly innovative or clever about this. You may well have seen this type of diagram before. And it simply starts with your question. Your question is about your practice, your art or design practice. And you plan something, you then act, you observe, you reflect, so that you can then plan and act and observe and reflect again. But it doesn't. The important thing is it isn't cyclical and then it goes round and round and round and never goes anywhere. The idea is it goes round so you can then move on, rather than getting trapped in just going round and round and round the same thing, and you never move on from that. So it's a case of planning, acting, looking at it, reflecting on it, so that you can then move forward and move on to something else. Others have used diagrams that are more like this, so it's kind of like spirals. There may be kind of certainly this sense of kind of moving upwards. An upwards trajectory is kind of a quite positive thing, and also multiple ones happening at the same time. Not necessarily a very rigid flow to this either. But there's certainly a sense of a cycle going round and round is a characteristic of action research. The second thing is collaborative. Now, the obvious thing with collaboration is it's with other people, and of course that is the case. And here, just as a slight aside, we do hit a bit of a problem with this place and this structure at the university. You're an MA student, and the power of the university fundamentally lies in the university's ability to give you a quantified qualification. At the end of your course, if you're successful, you get this master's qualification, and it is recognised because of the weight and the power of the university can appoint that and give you that. And that whole ceremony, the graduation ceremony, is about that. It's about you coming, receiving, and the power of the university to hand this over to you. Now, it creates a problem, particularly within art and design, because what that does is it means that the university treats you as an individual, not as a collaborative group. Because we're assessing you as an individual and then making that judgment to say, you have reached this standard, you individually have reached this standard, therefore we're going to appoint you, we're going to give you, empower you with this level of master's qualification. And we know that art and design practice is not individual. We need to, if you have any strange thoughts that art and design is created by the individual genius on their own, in isolation from everybody else, doing amazing work, get rid of that thought. It doesn't exist. It is a collaborative process at every possible level, in multiple different ways. So working with other people is a fundamental part of being creative, and it's a fundamental part of action research. The challenge is within university, we have to treat you as an individual. We have to focus on you as an individual, and that's a particular challenge, particularly at master's level, where you come with your research project to explore that. So what I'm saying is I'm admitting there's a challenge there, and I have no simple answer to it, but that we've got to find a way through it. But secondly, this sense of collaboration with materials. Now, normally you think of it with people, but I want you to think about it with your materials. Whatever your material is that you use to make your art and design, think of it as a collaboration, that it exists and that you are collaborating with those materials. That those materials have a life and an energy, a history, a theoretical structure, and that you're engaging with those materials, with all of that history and literally the actual chemicals and the molecules of the material itself as well. To see it as a collaboration, it's not just you taking power over it, you're collaborating with it as well. The third thing is qualitative, not quantitative, which is rather difficult to say. So what was interesting when I asked you about that kind of slightly silly question about the 100 children and the fruit, quite a few of you started thinking, understandably and correctly, how to find some kind of data, how to find something which said this produced this result. Generally, most people think of research within that category, and that's quantitative, which is much more focused on numbers. Something that can be measured, something that can be weighed, something that can be, you can actually gather some data to show we did this and therefore this happened. Art and design sits very, very much in the qualitative, not quantitative research framework. And qualitative is much more focused on words, feelings, emotions. It's messier, it's a little bit more confusing. It's not as clear-cut as quantitative. But that's very much where art and design research sits. And action research recognises that and emphasises that and sits in that place. And recognises that sometimes it's not possible to get very clear data. And something later which hopefully will emphasise that even more. The fourth thing is reflective. And I want to spend a little bit of time just exploring this, a little bit longer than the others, because this is crucial. I think this is crucial to action research, but also at the same time, it's crucial to your learning, to our learning, the way we learn. And therefore, it's a vital characteristic of action research, but it's also a vital characteristic of actually an MA course. I'm going to start with this quote. Reflection could be argued to be the essential stage where learning is integrated within the whole learner and added to existing frames of reference and internalised and personalised. I want to break this down a little bit because this is incredibly dense and is very, very rich and multi-layered in what's going on in this. This is a guy called Phil Race, who's Emeritus Professor at Leeds Beckett University, it's now called. Remarkable theorist on learning. If any of you are interested in that, in learning and education, it's really, really worth reading Phil Race. So what he's saying is reflection could be argued as the essential stage. So he spent years researching this and working in education settings. So in my mind, if he says this is essential stage, it really is essential because he's got a lot more experience than anybody in this room. So he's saying it could be argued as the essential stage where learning is integrated within the whole learner. So think about it, that idea that learning is not something which happens outside. Your research is not something which happens removed from you. Instead, it's something which needs to be integrated, like it's kind of woven together with what you already are. And that reflection is that process, is that stage where that happens, that integration happens. And it's integrated within the whole learner and added to existing frames of reference. That all of us have frames of reference. All of us have culture, history, language, our own experiences, our family. All of that is our frames of reference. They're the things that we understand, the way that we view and appreciate and navigate our way through the world. What he's saying is the reflection is that point when that learning actually gets added to those frames of reference. It's not just no longer something remote and removed, but it actually becomes part of who you are. It gets added into your frames of reference and then becomes internalised and personalised. So that same bit of learning is actually personalised to each of us. That same thing that we might have learned becomes so personal to us that it's actually different to me than it is to you. And that's an incredibly powerful thing if you think about it. And what Phil Race is suggesting is that reflection is the crucial stage where that happens. Another way of looking at it is reflection is not what you have done. So it's not just looking at this is what my actions, these are the things that I've done. Instead, it's about who you are when you are doing it, the things that you're doing. And that might sound initially a little bit strange, but what it's doing, what I'm hoping that a statement like that is encouraging you to do, is to encourage you to see yourself not removed from the things that you're doing. Because you could say, this is the work that I make, and you can just step back and look at it. But actually you need to look at who you are when you are doing that work. And that's what's the crucial point. That's the crucial stage where reflection starts to impact and drive the change and improvement which action research can help. Reflection tries to encapsulate change. It recognises change happens and it's trying to encapsulate, to gather that, to put it together. So you're asking questions like, when did change take place? What was the pivotal moment? When did it start to occur? When did it speed up? When did it slow down? So it's recognising that change happens. It's not something which it's always going to be the same. Your practice is developing and changing. The more that you spend time reflecting and researching your practice, the more it will change and you will keep moving forward with it. And reflection is trying to gather those moments so they don't pass away and you miss them. It's very, very easy when you're playing with your practice and you're kind of stretching yourself and you're trying new things. And I do this all the time. So in the studio, I'm playing around with something and I've played around with a new technique and think, that's fantastic. I'm really, really impressed with the way that's working. That little experiment kind of worked. All these other things didn't work, but this one did work. And I think, that's great. I'll never forget that because it's you get a kind of sense of exhilaration in that moment. 3 days later, I've forgotten what I did. And I think, how did I do that again? Because it's so easy to forget these things. And reflection is that time when you deliberately kind of gather that and say, well, what changed? What was different about that? What did I do? What was happening? Why was it so effective at that moment? So you capture it, you don't lose that. Because the danger is you very quickly forget. It's amazing how much we forget. Really, sometimes quite significant things, significant changes in our practice. We forget what triggered it, what happened and why it changed. So then we have to just go back again and do it all over again. So we've got these 4 characteristics. As I say, they're not a kind of a fixed rule, it's just characteristics. This is usually what, when you see action research, when you start thinking about how you're going to do this for yourself and your own practice, this is usually what it looks like. These kind of things play some kind of role. So, some questions for you. And this I'm going to give you a few minutes. I'm going to give you 3 minutes to do this, but on your own in silence to do this. So I want you to take some these minutes now to think. Potentially, the questions I'm only going to give you 3 or 4 minutes because we really haven't got much. Actually, wow, you're going to get 2.5 minutes to do this. But it's the kind of thing you might want to spend longer on to think about later. So the fairly simple questions, on the surface, they're fairly simple questions. But if you start thinking about it, it starts to open up into being quite deep. What do you make? In what ways do you want to change or improve what you make? And plan what you will do next in light of the characteristics of action research. So what do you make? That's seemingly quite simple, but actually, for you to actually be stopped and think, well, what is it do I make? Is actually quite a significant and important question. In what ways do you want to improve or change that? And then plan some things of what you're going to do. Literally plan, like, later today I'm going to do this in response to what my answers to this. Tomorrow I'm going to do this. On Friday I'm going to do this. Plan the next few days. Start thinking about, bearing in mind some of these cyclical, collaborative, qualitative, reflective characteristics of action research. So I will give you, okay, you can have 3 minutes. You can have 3 minutes to do that. Time's going, so I'm just going to jump through a bit of stuff and jump to something else. But any questions so far? Is this new, familiar? Some of you is familiar, I can see by your reactions. Has anybody deliberately kept a reflective journal before? Yeah. Few of you, yeah, okay. Because I'll come to that in a minute. That's an important thing. So those kind of questions that I've just asked you to consider, the kind of things which it's worth doing on a regular basis throughout the master's course, to kind of keep that sense of documenting the journey that you've been on. This is just in passing, but it's relevant and important for you to consider. You might have seen things like what we're talking about here can often be broken down into kind of nice simple structures and plans. Anybody seen this before, Kolb's learning cycle? This is a kind of a classic idea of how learning happens: concrete experience, reflective observation, abstract conceptualization. And to be honest, I've never used words like that ever in relation to learning. I quite like this alternative, which is something happens, what happens, so what, now what. It kind of captures more the sense of where learning often happens. It's quite gritty and down to earth, really, and you're not quite sure what's going on sometimes. But basically, that's that reflective cycle, pretty much, just in slightly different language going on in that. Phil Race, who I mentioned before, has a different way of looking at learning, which I think begins to get more kind of nuanced and more interesting to me. He talks about the idea of, this is his diagram, so I claim no responsibility for this, because it's pretty dire, isn't it? But he talks about the idea of ripples in a pond, and this idea that if you've got, learning happens when there's a need or a want. So the need to learn something, the want to learn something, that's the stone going into the water. That's what triggers the learning. Without that, nothing happens. You can have the best structure, you can have the best learning program set up, but nothing's going to happen unless the individual student desires, wants, needs to learn. And that's what triggers this in the first place. And then those ripples go out into the doing, the action of things. and then into the digesting he calls, or also sometimes calls it reflecting, where you begin to kind of think back on what you've been doing. And then feedback is crucial as well, from not just from staff but from your fellow students as well. That kind of feedback, and that just like ripples in a pond where there's a kind of an interaction, a flow. If you actually look at it, the flow goes in and out at the same time. It starts from that, but then there's no kind of clear when it goes from this point to this point to this point to this point. Instead, it's kind of ripples on a pond. I think it's a potentially more interesting thing, but a more interesting way of understanding learning. But crucially, it's from that need, that desire, that want. That's what triggers it in the first place. And you've shown that by being here in the first place. So that's triggered that already. And it's now kind of making sure you don't miss out on what's going on around you there. A lot of this kind of stuff, a lot of these kind of learning theories, action reflection, and action research theories often end up in kind of really quite kind of clear-cut, simple diagrams like this, where it all looks so. When you see it like that, I think, yeah, of course, it works. It's really easy. It's just these nice little steps which go round, or you get this one where it's just going round and round and round the sense of a nice upward journey, or you get these ones where you've got the word growth going right up the centre of it. You know. Well, yeah, if it's like this, it must be fine. It must be so easy to do this, you know. Or you've got following all these arrows, it's spiralling all over the place, and then and then this one we had lots of nice colours to it, stuff like that. The reality is that that's actually what learning looks like for most of us, and that's actually what our research is going to look like as well for most of us. It won't be as clean cut and as simple and as nicely stepped diagrammed as everybody likes to claim in the manuals. There's a sense of flow to this. There's a sense of something coming in or coming out. You're not quite sure, but there's something there. There's some kind of boundaries to it, but it's messy and it's confusing. And accepting that is probably a really important thing to do early on, and to accept that it will be messy and confusing. A lot of research is about dealing with failure, dealing with the things that don't work, dealing with the things that just don't function properly. If you've ever come across Crick and Watson, they're the two scientists who understood the DNA, the structure of DNA, one of the greatest breakthroughs in certainly biological science in history. They themselves said 99% of their experiments failed. So they get the Nobel Prize for that, and 99% of their experiments fail. Then I think we'd expect some of ours to fail, or at least not to work in the way we expect them to work. And it's not the important thing is you don't ignore that, you grab that. And you learn from that, and you integrate that into what it is you've been doing. We do need to mention a few more things, which helps give a bit more of the foundation to some of this. Anybody seen this book, The Reflective Practitioner? By Donald Schoen. It's back in 1983, I think it is. It's a seminal work, really, really important piece of work on reflective learning. I'm not saying you've got to read this. I'm just going to pick out a couple of key things from this. But if you are interested in this, then this is a really good one to read. I'm going to pick out one particular idea to begin with that he talks about, which is this idea where he describes reflection on action. And what he means by that is after the event thinking. So you've done something and then you spend time reflecting on it, looking at it and looking at you, yourself, and the action and who you are when you were doing it and what was happening there. And it's about the after event. So you've done something and you look back at it afterwards. You think, okay, now I understand what was happening. It could be as simple as, why did that not work? And it's because it was too cold and I felt really uncomfortable. It's recognising really basic things like that can be really important. So after the event thinking is reflecting on action. But he also talked about the idea of reflecting in action. And by that he meant thinking while doing. So in English there's this phrase, thinking on your feet. And it's that idea that it's reflecting on action, you do something and then maybe you sit down and think about it afterwards. But reflecting in action is something that you do in the very moment, the way you're doing something. The important thing is, often in those moments you don't actually know what to do. You're in a situation where you don't actually know, I've not been here before, so I don't know what the procedure is here. I'm playing with some new material and I'm not quite sure what to do next with this because it's running out of my boundaries of control. And the crucial thing that Schoen suggested was that by doing the reflection on action strengthens the ability to reflect in action. So that in those moments where you're pushing yourself and you're stretching yourself outside of your comfort zones, because you've been doing the reflecting on what you've done before, because of that, you know what to do in those situations. You can draw on all of that experience into that moment and then find a way forward. He said this, and he writing in 1983, and I haven't changed this, he uses the male pronoun in this. So this is his words. The practitioner allows himself to experience surprise, puzzlement, or confusion in a situation which he finds uncertain or unique. He reflects on the phenomenon before him and on the prior understanding which has been implicit in his behaviour. He carries out an experiment which serves to generate both a new understanding of the phenomenon and a change in the situation. So just to break that down into its separate parts, the practitioner allows themselves to experience surprise, puzzlement, or confusion in a situation which they find uncertain or unique. So what he's encouraging, because he's talking about reflective practitioners in every field. He isn't talking specifically about art and design, although his ideas fit really, really well for us. It's actually, his ideas are right across any discipline. So what he's saying is it's actually a good thing to be in the place of surprise, puzzlement, or confusion. That you need to allow yourself to do that, to actually look for those situations. And then they reflect on the phenomenon before them and on the prior understanding which has been implicit in their behaviour. So you're not just reflecting on this moment of surprise, but on your behaviour in that moment of surprise. And that reflective process becomes really understanding, and particularly in this idea of the implicit behaviour, the things which you do which is almost unthinking. These are natural for you. And part of action research and part of this reflective stuff is recognising those things which are implicit in you, those things which are natural and inherent. The habitual things you do, recognising those so that you can change them, improve them, get rid of them if they're not helpful, but crucially so you can improve. And then they carry out an experiment which serves to generate both a new understanding of the phenomenon and a change in the situation. So you're in the place of puzzlement, you spend some time reflecting on it so that you can then act. So you can actually set up an experiment, in this case he uses the language of experiment, so it actually helps you understand what was going on, and then you can change that situation. So in a way, what he said in a lot of words, exactly that cycle that we've been looking at. Another thing he talked about was that he was not anti what he called technical rationality, but he wanted to provide an alternative to it. Technical rationality he described as a thing where basically that problems are solvable through rigorous application of science. And he said actually, yes, sometimes it's necessary, but actually he was much more interested in what he called professional artistry. And again, he's not talking specifically about artists and designers. He's talking about nurse practitioners, accountants, all kinds of people. But he used this term professional artistry, that this is what he wanted to encourage people to do. The reflective actions actually helps you do this. And particularly the reflection in action was the crucial part of developing this professional artistry, so that you would encourage intuitive practice over protocols. Now, protocol says that in this situation I do this, 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 and this. In that situation I do this, 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 and this. And in some situations you want protocols. If you turn up at hospital and you've had a terrible, terrible accident, you want them to follow protocols. You don't want them to stand around thinking, should we try something different today and just have a bit of fun with this patient? You want them to follow exactly the protocols which they deal with when someone comes in with your accident. So there's some situations where you want that. But many situations, Schoen suggested that actually you don't want that. That just following protocols means that when you're in a situation where you haven't been there before, there's no protocol, you're stationary because you can't do anything. Because protocol becomes the most important thing. And he said that reflection in action allows you to develop this professional artistry so that you can be more intuitive. And you can actually strengthen that. So instead of intuition being this kind of just wishy-washy thing where you just kind of do it and you're not quite sure why you do it, he's actually saying this is something you can develop. This is something you can become professional in. You can actually be a professional artist and have a professional artistry, at least, in your actions. So professional practice is complex, unpredictable, and messy. In order to cope, professionals have to be able to do more than simply follow procedures. They draw on both practical experience and theory as they think on their feet and improvise. Anybody done any theatre work where you improvise? Yeah. So improvisation is not making it up on the spot, is it? It's really quite a rigorous process of understanding character, and then so that your actions are faithful to that character, aren't they, in those situations? It's a bit like that. You're rigorously understanding you so that you are faithful to who you are in those situations. But you can literally think on your feet, not make it up, but think on your feet. And they act both intuitively and creatively. Both reflection in action and on action allows them to revise, modify, and refine their expertise. So really important, revise, modify, and refine expertise. You're kind of pushing things further and further and further. So you might feel that you're an expert in one particular thing, but actually this is an opportunity to push that even further. I mentioned reflective blogs, reflective journals, which are really, really important. For my students, fine art digital students, they have to have a blog. Many other students are encouraged to do this in the form of a blog. I haven't got time to go into it right now, but there's very, very good reasons why a blog is really, really effective as your reflective journal. But basically, you have to have a journal. You have to have some kind of reflective journal, which is not just these are the things I did, but it has to go deeper than that. So you're capturing this action research process which you're involved in, and it's keeping a record of actions, decisions, thought processes, successes and failures, and the issues that you are dealing with. So, action research, methodology or method. I'm going to argue that action research is the overall methodology, the broad framework across the top, which is fundamentally, to put it very simply, the methodology is you making your work. That's your methodology. It's nothing more complicated than that in some ways. But as you've seen already, there's a lot of kind of layers and nuance to it as well. There are lots of methods, tools which you can use to actually explore that. The obvious ones are the tools that you use to make your work and the processes. But let me put up some others which might help you to push your levels of skill and ability and expertise in this. So audio, photographic, video records, that's really obvious. But it's surprising how we forget to do that. So particularly in the moments of developing work, take time to capture it. You're in the middle of making something, get your phone out and take a photo of it in the process as well. And capture those things. Don't just let it float away, but capture those processes and the steps involved in it. Case studies, now those can be for yourself as well. You can kind of set up a case study. But in particular, looking at other people, it's really, really helpful to look at other creative practitioners doing work which is maybe similar. Not always, sometimes it's good to see people doing something quite different to you, but look at their processes, try and understand the way they go about making their work as well. Diaries, journals, logs, keeping a regular documentation of what it is you're doing, what you're thinking, what you're reading, the questions you're asking yourself, that is really important as well. Field notes, so that idea of actually not literally sitting in a field unless your work is related to a field, but it comes from that idea that when you're doing a piece of work in a particular location, you do some notes, you capture something about that place as well, not just about something you can do back afterwards. You capture something of that place, the feeling, the emotions of that place. Interaction analysis. Now, this is used a lot in some areas of action research, and less so in art and design. But I think there's something in this which might be worth considering. At a very simple level, what I mean is simply how people view or use your work. If you're making something which is to be picked up and used, then you really do need to kind of give people opportunities to play with it and see how they use it. But if you're just putting work on the wall, for example, it's a question of how do people engage it, how do people look at it, what draws their eye to it. Asking people, if you have the opportunity to show your work and talk to people and say, and talk about it. You can even pretend you're not the artist and just kind of see what they think of it, and then reveal afterwards, particularly if they like your work, you can tell them it was yours. But understanding that, so a crucial part of that is taking every opportunity to show your work in any way you can. And don't be shy about that, don't hold it back. Put it out there, try it out. That's an experiment. Even if you feel it might not be fully finished and you're really confident about it, get it out, put it out there, get it in the public and get people engaging with it and seeing how people react. Interviews is an obvious thing as well. Just one little tip, if you do interviews, interviews are a really, really good way of gathering information and feedback, and particularly effective for action research. It doesn't give you data, it's very qualitative because it's very much about people's feelings and emotions, but it's very, very useful to do that. There are several different ways to do it, and you can too much to go into right now, but just one little tip. If you are doing interviews and you do feel that that's a useful thing to gather information, record them, but don't make them really, really, really long. I did some work a few years ago where I spent 5 hours with an artist in their studio and we recorded it all. And then for this particular piece of research, we had to transcribe it all. So I had to sit and type out 5 hours of interview, of discussion that went on. Because it needed to be in the appendix for this piece of research we did. So if you're going to do interviews, try and keep them short because it's much easier to deal with later. Participant and non-participant observation. So it's a bit like the interaction analysis, but it's actually kind of choosing to observe how people do it. Now, not necessarily in your own work. You might want to go to a gallery or to an exhibition or to a shop or anywhere where potentially you might relate to your work and just watch the way people use space, for example, or the way people use objects and think through that as well. And that might be people who are participants, and you might ask people to do that, but there may also be people you're just observing. So many different ways. Questionnaires as well is an obvious one to gather information. Usually questionnaires can be quite dry. That's the problem. Personally, I find interviews a little bit better because you can still have a kind of a structure to it, a semi-structure to it if you want. But just sending off questionnaires, you not always get the most interesting information back. But nevertheless, it can be very effective. So there's some things there which are used more in social sciences, used less in art and design. But I just want to put those up there so that you're kind of aware of them and think, oh, maybe there's something else I could use in the research. A couple of final things just to highlight here. One is this idea that the science experiment leads to no change. And this is the idea that a science experiment tends to be, not always, but the majority of science experiments is the idea that I set up a control structure here, I perform this experiment, and the idea is that you could also perform that same experiment. And that's what proves that what I said was right. Or you disprove it if you show that you set up the same things and you can't make it happen. And so science experiment leads to no change in the person doing the experiment or in the worlds around them. But I want to argue that the art and design experiment does always or should always lead to change. Change in you as the artist, the designer, the practitioner, and change in the world. But what you have done, the world can never go back pre that moment. The world has changed. It may be quite simple. You might think, well, the world hasn't changed dramatically on the back of one piece of work that I've made. But the world has changed. It might be quite small, but it has changed. You have changed because of it as well. You can't go back prior to that and then kind of imagine, well, what if I chose not to do that and I do something different? You can't, because you've already done that. And particularly if you reflect on it, there is no way of going back to it. Here's a quote. But the artist, and this book is about art, but I think you can make the same suggestion about a broader idea of art and design and creative practice. But the artist, if asked whether an art piece could be remade with identical results, would have to answer no, or it wouldn't be art. In making a piece of art, both the artist and the artist's world are changed. And re-asking the same question, facing the next blank canvas, will always yield a different answer. The world has changed because of what you've done. And that's an interesting thing and a valuable thing. It's a valuable thing to understand, but it's a valuable thing for the world as well. There is a moment for each artist in which a particular truth can be found. And if it is not found then, it will not ever be found. Now just think about that. There's a particular moment when, for each artist in which a particular truth can be found. And if it is not found then, it will never be found. Now that's potentially quite a lot of pressure on us, but actually I find that quite exciting. That what we're exploring through our work and our creative practice is finding new things. And we find those things. If we don't find them, no one else will. Because it's unique to us, and that kind of process is unique to us. And therefore there's something quite exhilarating and exciting about that process and discovering that. Don't take that as a pressure. I think it should be more a kind of an excitement and a release. They talk about Hamlet and Shakespeare, these two authors, the idea that once Shakespeare had written Hamlet, the world can't go back to before Hamlet. It's not possible. It doesn't exist. The world now exists with Hamlet. You can't go back prior to that. Shakespeare couldn't. We can't. It's not possible. They talked about unfalsifiable, something. The idea of an experiment being that you can falsify it, you can prove that it's false. You can't do that with art and design. It's not. It is unfalsifiable. You can't prove that it's wrong in that way. And they also talked about, we haven't really got time to go into this now, but they also talked about phenomenology and hermeneutics as a different approach, a different way of engaging with the world and understanding these things, but we can talk about that another time. So, a couple of final things. If we knew what we were doing, it would not be called research, would it? Albert Einstein. If we actually knew what we were doing, we wouldn't call it research. That's the point. We don't actually know what we're doing. And this whole process is about discovering what that is. The sad thing is that actually there's no evidence that Albert Einstein ever said that. It's a great quote though, isn't it? But it's unfortunately, there is absolutely no evidence he ever said that. If I had actually said all the things people claim I said, I wouldn't have had any time to do any research. And you'd be surprised to know that Albert Einstein didn't say that either, obviously. This is interesting though, and this is from a science, this is in the Journal of Cell Science. So this is a scientist, a full-on, hard, heavy science kind of stuff. The more comfortable we become with being stupid, the deeper we will wade into the unknown, and the more likely we are to make big discoveries. And what he means, the whole paper is about stupidity, and he said, this is not relative stupidity, as in you just haven't done the basic work. You just don't know how to use an etching plate, for example, or whatever it is. Or in this case, you just don't know how cells work. That's stupid. That's just relative stupidity. What he's talking about is what he called, I think he called it professional stupidity. I forget the term he used, but it's something like that. Anyway, and it's the idea that you're beyond the bounds of your own knowledge and beyond the bounds of knowledge. And that actually that's a place where often what he's describing is that scientists would often stay inside that because they don't want to look stupid by making some kind of weird claim and then it proves to be completely wrong. And he's saying, no, go out there. Go into those places where it's kind of stretching yourself beyond it. And if he's saying that to scientists, then we should be getting hold of that idea as well and going for that. So the final thing, and I know there's a couple of people who need to run off, so go. I'm going to leave you with some questions for you to think about. And I'll give you a couple of minutes to think about these questions, which actually is kind of summing up the kind of stuff that we've been talking about. So it's very simple. What have you done so far? And what would be interesting is to ask that question, what have you done so far as an MA student in Campbell? Which is basically 1 week, isn't it? A week and a bit. So ask yourself that. What have I done so far? It might scare you to actually stop and think, well, what have I done? Maybe you've done a lot, maybe you haven't. But ask yourself that. What have I done so far as an MA student? What have you discovered so far in this week and a bit? What will you change because of what have you discovered? Because what you've discovered? And then what will you do next? And all I've done there, I'll put these back in a minute, but basically all I've done is I've done that. I've just kind of asked questions of exactly that cycle going round. So what have you done? What have you discovered so far? What will you change because of what you've discovered? And what will you do next? So I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that, to have a think, because it's worth taking a bit of time just to think about this. And then we'll be finished. Okay, can I suggest that you do something in the last couple of minutes? Not really, you need to give a bit more time on this, but just maybe try this. Taking those thoughts which you've had related to that in twos, so just like the person next to you, tell them what you said to yourself or what you wrote down. And the reason for that is that there's one thing to think like that, and there's one thing to kind of have it in your own mind or even in your own notebook. It's a different thing to then speak that out to somebody else. What happens in that moment as you speak it out, it becomes something living, something which isn't just private and hidden for you. It becomes something which is alive and someone else knows about it. And potentially there's some accountability. There's some collaboration with that other person as well, because they may be able to see you and say, did you do what you said you were going to do? And you've got this accountability to each other. And therefore it becomes something more real and more alive and something which is more likely to happen than if it's just your own thoughts and you can write it down. Because we can fool ourselves. We can have the greatest plans in our notebooks. The reality is, do we put them into practice? And part of putting it into practice is actually talking to somebody else and asking someone to kind of check up on you to do that. So just take the person next to you and just tell them what your thoughts were in response to that and what you were planning to do next. don't stop your conversations, carry on. But that's the end. If you need to go, go. If you've got questions, come and ask me. But carry on the conversations. You're welcome to stay in. Nothing's in here straight away. So if you want to sit around and have a chat, that's fine. No problem.